Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Animal Legal Defense Fund's Animal Law Academy. My name is Alyssa Crowell, and I'm the Law School Programs Attorney. I am happy that you're able to join us today as we take a look at some legislative updates. Joining me today is Stephanie Harris, Senior Legislative Affairs Manager. Thank you so much for taking your time to share your wisdom with us today, and I will pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. As was mentioned, my name is Stephanie Harris. I go by Steph. Feel free to call me that. I use she, her pronouns. And as was mentioned, I serve as the Senior Legislative Affairs Manager for the Animal Legal Defense Fund. Welcome to our Fall 2022 State and Federal Affairs Update webinar. I'm so glad to have you all here with us. This slide features photos and names of our Legislative Affairs Program team members, and excitingly, our Leg Affairs team has grown significantly over the past few years. Today, Kim K is our director, Kathy S and Alicia P are our strategic legislative affairs manager. Jennifer H and Brian H are our legislative affairs managers, and Lindsay V is our fellow. We have a range of legal and professional backgrounds. Kim, Alicia, and Lindsay are lawyers, and others of us have studied political science and have particular expertise with political campaigns, lobbying, and legislative advocacy. To connect with us, you can email legislation@aldf.org. And if you're interested in legislative advocacy professionally, please keep an eye on our website for any opportunities to join our team. You can visit aldf.org/jobs. And if you're a law student in legislative affairs, we typically bring on about 3 students each summer and fall and spring semester. And depending on the time frame and certain other factors, students may join us on the legislative affairs team as a clerk, an extern, or a volunteer law student. There's a link to those student opportunities from aldf.org/jobs too. So for example, our clerkships are typically available in the summer and they're full-time. Our externships are available for the summer as well as the fall and spring semester. And then the volunteer law opportunities tend to be available year-round. And there's different requirements for each position and different limitations or flexibility in terms of the number of hours worked and when those hours are. And our clerks, externs, and volunteers are typically either state affairs or federal affairs focused. Law students can also engage with the work that we do and the work of other programs at our organization via their Student Animal Legal Defense Fund chapter at their law school. And if your school doesn't have one, you could potentially launch your own. These student chapters play a significant role in helping pass legislation. And as a perfect example of this, you can check out Kathy's webinar, Animal Legal Defense Fund Student Chapters and Courtroom Animal Advocate Programs, How You Can Help. You can find that at aldf.org/webinar. I also want to give a personal shout out to the student chapter at Suffolk University Law School in Boston for providing testimony in support of a Massachusetts possession ban bill that's currently pending before the state legislature this session. There are also plenty of opportunities for folks interested in serving as volunteer advocates or citizen lobbyists, and you're in exactly the right place right now. I'll share more about why and how to get started to increase your involvement in this work, as well as share some updates from this past quarter. Our legislative affairs team provides these webinars on a quarterly basis. So if you want to check out some of the recent ones, you can find Jennifer's presentation in June and Brian's from March. And you'll likely notice that the work of legislative affairs is very cyclical. And although each state, each jurisdiction has a different legislative session. And so you can find more about all of that at aldf.org/webinar. This slide also includes a map of staff coverage by state, and our team covers all 50 states as well as federal affairs. And this map can be a helpful place to determine who the best staff person is to contact based on your state or your interest in federal affairs. I'm based in Massachusetts, and I cover all of New England, Ohio, and a band of Western states, as well as Hawaii. Alicia is based in the DC area. She covers Maryland, South, and as far west as Arkansas and Louisiana, as well as Michigan and Illinois. And she also manages all of our federal work. Brian is based in New Jersey. He covers New Jersey. as well as New York, Delaware, West Virginia, Kentucky, and the remaining Midwestern states. Jennifer is based out in Oregon, and she covers all the West Coast, the remaining Western states, as well as Alaska, Texas, and Oklahoma. And depending on what our bandwidth allows, we are still a fairly small team, but growing. Each of us monitors and engages in lobbying and legislative advocacy in these areas. Our work is largely at the state and federal level, but we do also engage at the local level in certain cases. Before I delve any deeper into where we engage on what, let's talk briefly about the levels of government in the United States. Legislators, also known as elected officials across these levels of government, are the folks that we particularly need your help to connect with. And if you're not already familiar with who yours are, you can look them up, your personal elected officials, at aldf.org/find-your-elected-officials. The local level can include municipal, sometimes called town or city government, or occasionally township, village, or borough government, as well as county government. And the specific structure may include an elected city council and mayor, a town select board, a county commission, just as a few examples. And in New England, you might have representative town meeting, which, like some of the other forms, is representative democracy, where voters are electing representatives or legislators to pass laws. Or you may have open town meeting, which is a form of direct democracy where all registered voters in the community are eligible to vote, acting together as a town's legislature. And that's often done annually or biannually or under special circumstances. And without delving too deeply into this, we've got some great webinars specifically focused on the local level. So some of the areas we often engage at the local level are they're typically called local ordinances or bylaws, and the issues include shutting down the puppy mill to pet shop pipeline by banning the retail pet store sale of dogs, cats, and rabbits. As you may know, pet stores are often a preferred sales outlet for puppy mills because they allow that cruelty to remain hidden from the consumer. Other local legislation includes ending the use of wild animals in circuses and traveling shows, and banning the sale of new fur products, which are contributing to the fur farming industry that kills many millions of animals worldwide each year. And you can find our webinars on each of these issues hosted by my friend and former Animal Legal Defense Fund colleague, Liz Holtz, at aldf.org/webinars. At the state level, the governing body is typically called the state legislature or the general court. In all states but one, this body is divided into two chambers, the upper chamber, which is known as the Senate, and the lower chamber known as the House of Representatives or the Assembly. And at the federal level, Congress is the governing body. It includes the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives. Each state has 2 U.S. senators and at least 1 U.S. representative or congressperson, and the exact number is determined by the state's population. At the state and federal level, we work on a range of issues to protect farmed animals, wildlife, companion animals, and animals in research, as well as to elevate the legal status of animals beyond mere property. And despite huge leaps in our understanding of the intelligence and the rich emotional and social lives of non-human animals, they are still typically treated more like property in our legal system, like inanimate objects rather than living beings, the sentient beings that they are. To make the world a kinder place for animals, you can help by developing close relationships with legislators across these levels of government, getting to know your town select boards or your city councilors, your county commissioners, as well as your state senator and state representative or assembly member, and your U.S. senator and U.S. representative. It can easily feel confusing because there's so much jargon in this field, but it can also be really helpful to remember that legislators, these elected officials, they are just people, and they're people who likely ran for elected office to make a positive change in their communities. And they're people elected by your community to represent you. And so altogether, this means that your elected official should and likely does want to hear from you. You can learn more about the dynamics between voters and elected officials and the role that political organizations can play by checking out our webinar from last summer, which is Animal Legal Defense legislative fund, the role of 501c4s in animal advocacy. And this past year, we officially launched the Animal Legal Defense Legislative Fund, a 501c4 affiliate organization of the Animal Legal Defense Fund. That webinar highlights the unique role a C4 can play in campaigns as well as the legislative arena. So to sum up this slide, I really hope that the takeaway is that you have elected officials at various levels of government who can help pass laws across these various levels. And they really need to hear from you about animal protection legislation and also developing an informal, a casual relationship with them, getting to know them as people can make a huge difference when you come to make a specific ask on a piece of, for example, animal protection legislation. So why lobby for animals? Here are 3 of the many reasons: to pass laws that protect animals and advance their interests in the legal system, to stop laws that harm animals from passing into law, and to ensure the best interests of animals are part of the legislative discussion. But let's talk about what lobbying is. It's the act of seeking to influence lawmakers, including in support or opposition of an issue or a piece of legislation. And you may have known or guessed that it's called lobbying because essentially folks hang out in the lobby of a legislature, hoping to catch a lawmaker on their way in or out to chat with them about a piece of legislation or an issue. And pre-pandemic, my colleagues and I in legislative affairs would spend a lot of time in person in state legislatures in our home states and across the country, seeking to persuade legislators to help pass laws to protect animals, as well as stop bills that could harm animals before they became law. And because every state legislature is set up differently, the mechanics of lobbying can look a little different from state to state or jurisdiction to jurisdiction. For example, some states have part-time legislators. So an example is in Rhode Island, folks are usually only in the building in late afternoons and into the early evenings. Other states, though, may have full-time legislators who keep more standard business hours. In some states, each legislator has their own office that you might be able to visit in that state house. And in others, state-specific offices might be reserved only for legislators who are in leadership positions, or maybe they're shared by a number of legislators who are on the same committee. And some legislators may, whether they have an office in the state house or not, they may also have in-district offices or offer drop-in in-district hours, maybe at a local coffee shop. And so you can look into that by getting to know your state legislators specifically, and they often have an e-newsletter or a website that lists out that specific information. And lobbying can look like scheduling one-on-one meetings or coalition meetings with legislators or their staff at the state house or in district, just depending on how things are set up in your area. And it could look like hanging out in the lobby of your state house, strategically positioned in the halls to catch legislators for a quick unscheduled conversation on their way to and fro. Or attending a public hearing or other formal opportunity to provide testimony, either written or verbal input. And since the pandemic, many legislatures have gone remote or more recently have some sort of hybrid model where they're part remote and part in person. So this means that some meetings and public hearings may be virtual, they may be in person, or they may be offered in both formats. So it's helpful to check that out on your state legislature's website, which is pretty easy to find for the most part by just doing a quick Google search for your state name and then the term state legislature. And regardless of where it takes place and whether it's in person or virtual, the most effective lobbying involves relationship building. So really getting to know your legislators and their staff. And that relationship can start with just a single phone call, an email, a meeting, and none of which is limited to professionals in suits. Citizen lobbyists can arguably make the biggest impact of all. And to learn more about some of the best practices in lobbying, especially in today's world, you can check out the webinar from Kathy from a summer or two ago, Lobbying 101, Advocacy in a New Era. And you can find that at aldf.org/webinar. This and other webinars discuss how a bill becomes a law, so I won't delve too deeply into that. However, a couple important things to note is that the legislative process is different in each jurisdiction. So it can be helpful to do a little bit of research into yours specifically. And one of the ways to go about that is to ask your legislator. That can be a good way to get introduced to them and start hearing from them about how things work for them. And then you can, provide some perspective on why you care about the issues that you do. And then the other is that legislative advocacy tends to be cyclical work. And so that means that depending on when in the legislative session in your particular jurisdiction you are, the way you're engaging might look different. So in many jurisdictions, legislative sessions are annual and they run from January to maybe spring or summer. Some states have biannual sessions spanning 2 years, and at the federal level, a Congress spans 2 years, but each year constitutes its own legislative session. As I mentioned, this work is cyclical, and depending on when you engage, you may be able to help lobby key legislators to formally introduce a piece of legislation for consideration by the legislature, urging them to take on a leadership role on the issue as a sponsor, or lobby legislators to co-sponsor legislation that was filed by another legislator, urging them essentially to lend their name in support of an issue. You may be lobbying legislators on a key legislative committee where legislation was referred, urging them to, say, hold a public hearing on the bill or to vote in favor of it. It may be critical to lobby members of leadership and certain key legislators to pass a bill. So something already passed by committee, maybe through the full chamber. Or to lobby for a bill to be signed into law. And that could be by the governor if it's at the state level, the president at the federal level, or mayor at the local level. And one can lobby key decision makers as the bill moves through the legislative process, as well as their own legislators. And the strategy on that often varies from state to state. So please feel free to reach out to the colleague in Leg Affairs that covers the state that you're in for some guidance on what might be most helpful. At the federal level, there are about a half dozen pieces of legislation that we would really welcome your help with right now. On this slide, you'll see the title and bill numbers of some of those bills. And in Congress, pieces of legislation or bills are prefixed with HR if they're introduced in the House and S if they're introduced in the Senate. And that's followed by a number, and that's based on the order in which those were introduced. So up first, we've got the Big Cat Public Safety Act, which prohibits the private possession of big cats and direct contact with them. The bill passed in the House, and we're working on getting it through the Senate, and hopefully it will be passed into law this Congress. And for context, millions of wild animals are forced to live in captivity in the United States. And while some states have restricted or banned private possession of certain wild animals, other states have virtually no regulations. And big cats belong in the wild, or in situations where captive animals can no longer safely be returned to the wild, in accredited sanctuaries that are really equipped to meet their complex physical and psychological needs. And allowing untrained people to maintain big cats in their homes not only harms the animals, it seriously threatens public safety and fuels the wild pet trade by creating a financial incentive for people to capture big cats in the wild and breed them for the purpose of selling cubs. The Big Cat Public Safety Act also makes it illegal for exhibitors, such as circuses and zoos, to allow direct contact with cubs. Some facilities encourage members of the public to handle cubs through petting or bottle feeding and a photo op. These young animals may be drugged to keep them docile enough to handle, and even their teeth and claws can pose a serious public health risk. They're also often separated from their mothers very young, which can lead to serious behavioral consequences. The Captive Primate Safety Act, this federal legislation was refiled with a new provision that would prohibit private possession of primates in addition to prohibiting interstate and foreign commerce. Non-human primates like chimpanzees and orangutans and other apes are often subjected to the so-called exotic or wild pet trade. But even the most well-intentioned private possessor cannot replicate the complex family structures or meet the physical needs of these animals. The Animal Legal Defense Fund encourages local and state governments to enact legislation prohibiting the private possession of non-human primates and strongly supports this federal bill. There's also the Farm System Reform Act, which would place a moratorium on the largest category of CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, by 2040. Essentially, it would overhaul our broken food system by placing a moratorium on the largest factory farms, immediately prohibiting the creation or expansion of large factory farms and requiring the cessation of such operations by 2040. It's the first step towards shifting away from our current factory farming model and toward a more sustainable agricultural system. Additionally, the bill would hold large factory farms responsible for their environmental impacts, restore mandatory country of origin labeling requirements for cow, pig, and dairy products, as well as prohibit the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, from labeling meat products imported from other countries as product of the United States. For context, an estimated 9 billion land animals are killed for food in the US alone each year. The vast majority of them live in cages and crates so small that they cannot turn around or stretch their limbs. Farmed animals held in factory farms are unable to engage in natural behaviors or even go outside. They often endure untreated illnesses, painful injuries, and are subjected to cruel practices, like having their testicles, tails, horns, beaks, or toes removed without anesthesia. And that's all before they're ultimately slaughtered. In addition to being responsible for extreme animal suffering, industrial animal agriculture is a major contributor to air and water pollution. And many of these impacts are felt most acutely by low-income communities of color. Industrial animal agriculture is controlled by a few gigantic vertically integrated, meaning every step of the supply chain is controlled, multinational corporations. And these corporations often operate without regard for the environment, animals, public health, or workers' rights. There's also the Animal Welfare Enforcement Improvement Act, which would strengthen the Animal Welfare Act licensing and renewal process to ensure more accountability and transparency. Animal dealers and exhibitors, such as roadside zoos and commercial dog breeders, must obtain a USDA license to be in compliance with the Animal Welfare Act. And while these licenses must be regularly renewed, the USDA commonly rubber stamps approvals, even when there are ongoing or repeated violations. And this legislation aims to strengthen that licensing and renewal process to hold animal dealers and exhibitors accountable. Goldie's Act amends the Animal Welfare Act to require the USDA to confiscate animals that are suffering at AWA facilities. In less than 2 years, a single puppy mill breeder in Iowa amassed approximately 190 Animal Welfare Act violations noted in the USDA inspection reports. And one of those violations was related to a golden retriever known only as number 142. She was identified by USDA investigators as emaciated and in need of immediate care in April 2021, but she was left on the property. And when investigators returned to the puppy mill in July, the puppy miller attempted to hide the dog known as number 142. And the investigators did find her, but due to her emaciated condition, she had to be euthanized. Investigators alleged that the puppy miller failed to comply with the order to provide adequate veterinary care for the dog. And this information was only revealed in September of 2021 after the Department of Justice filed a civil suit against that puppy miller for violating the Animal Welfare Act. Lawmakers and the public were distressed that the USDA had not removed animals who are suffering during that inspection. And so the bill sponsor of this federal legislation sought to give the dog labeled number 142 some dignity in death by naming the golden retriever Goldie, and in partnership with a bipartisan group of lawmakers introduced Goldie's Act. The bill would amend the Animal Welfare Act to require the USDA enforce strengthened regulations set forth in the proposed bill. And then finally, we oppose the Livestock Regulatory Protection Act. This legislation would exempt certain factory farms called CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, under the Clean Air Act. And this permitting program requires large stationary sources of air emissions to obtain a permit to conduct compliance reports. And without these reports, we have no way of knowing whether a CAFO is actually complying with the Clean Air Act. And this is essentially just another bill looking to give CAFOs a free pass to do whatever they want to pollute freely. To take action on these bills and other priorities, please visit aldf.org/legislation-federal-bills. Shifting our focus to state level work, this slide shows whether your state or territory is in session right now. Because of where we are in the calendar year, there are very few states in session at this time. Often, as I mentioned earlier, sessions will start in January and run through the spring or summer. So things in the fall tend to be a little bit slower. And even for those states in session, sometimes things are moving a bit more slowly as legislators head into potentially the 2022 election cycle. Each legislative session, ALDF works on many dozens of bills, and our staff may play a leadership or supportive role in coalitions that are backing, or depending on the state, sometimes sponsoring legislation. Since our last webinar, we're excited to share a few of the legislative victories for animals, despite this being a slightly slower time. And these are bills that our staff in legislative affairs have supported. And depending on the bill and the jurisdiction, our engagement might have included drafting the legislation, active on the ground or virtual lobbying of key legislators, submitting testimony or letters of support on behalf of the Animal Legal Defense Fund or as part of a broader coalition, reaching out to you all, our supporters, via email or social media, and urging you to contact your legislators in support. And if you did that, thank you so much. ALDF, the Animal Legal Defense Fund, is very proud to have worked with coalition partners and legislators to support the following bills, which saw major progress. In California, several animal protection bills were signed into law very recently, including 3 just this week. There's the puppy mill finance ban, which was sponsored by the Animal Legal Defense Fund. That's how things work in California. And it bans predatory consumer loans of dogs and cats. It's a measure that is another step forward in limiting the number of animals bred in puppy and kitten mills that are being purchased in California. And for a little bit of context, in 2019, California passed the California retail sales ban on dogs and cats went into effect, but that did not extend to online sales. And according to some data from shipping and courier companies that facilitate the transport of animals, California is the #1 importer of dogs and cats in the nation. And online sales allow puppy mills to continue to reach California consumers through the cloak of often sanitized imagery and obfuscated origination information. Most of the large online brokers that transport puppies to in-state customers offer financing. And this financing can be a key part of animal sale proposals. Average consumers may not be able to afford to spend the thousands of dollars for a puppy, but predatory lenders can easily turn casual browsers into purchasers by including a link to instantaneously apply for seemingly low or no interest short-term financing, even for those with no credit. Full disclosure of interest rates, fees, payoff amount, and general loan terms are not available until after a loan application is made, and critically after an emotional connection to a photo of a specific animal and the desire to bring that animal into their life is already present. So this puppy mill financing bill was sponsored by the Animal Legal Defense Fund. It passed the legislature in August and was signed into law just this week. Similar laws have been passed in Illinois, and I believe Pennsylvania is considering something similar. Also signed into law in California is an animal evacuations and disasters law. It requires kennels to have disaster evacuation plans as part of their license requirements. The dog toxicity testing, the PET Act, Prevent Extraneous Testing, prohibits a contract testing facility from conducting toxicology experiments on dogs and cats unless expressly required for FDA or EPA compliance. Another of other bills signed into law this summer or earlier earlier this fall include the Dog and Cat Transportation Act. It requires mobile or traveling housing facilities, such as animal control vehicles, to transport dogs and cats in such a manner that conditions do not endanger the health or well-being of the animal due to extreme temperatures or lack of food or water. The low income housing tax credit pet incentives incentivizes developers and landlords of projects that receive these tax credits to allow pets with no breed or size restrictions or pet fees. In Massachusetts this quarter, the legislature passed three critical animal protection bills, including the wildlife poaching bill, the beagle bill, and a wildlife crossing provision in a bigger bill. And those were all signed into law. The poaching bill in Massachusetts protects the welfare and conservation of native species that are important to Massachusetts ecosystem. It modernizes penalties for illegal hunting, some of which are out of date by about a century. So, for example, it extends license suspension durations for certain violations. And it also authorizes Massachusetts to enter into the Interstate Wildlife Violator Compact. And that is a nationwide compact that already benefits every other state wildlife agency in the United States. Massachusetts was the last state to join the compact, so we're thrilled to get that over across the finish line. There's also the Beagle Bill, or the adoption of retired dogs and cats in research. A lot of the dogs used in research happen to be beagles, and it wound up with that nickname of Beagle Bill. And it allows for the retirement of dogs and cats that were used in laboratories at research institutions or product testing facilities to be offered for adoption through a nonprofit animal shelter or rescue or via private placement when a necropsy is not mandated for this study. And then also there was the wildlife crossings issue. And so a provision within the larger transportation bond bill facilitates the study of the feasibility and the creation of an action plan for wildlife crossing projects via collaboration between the Massachusetts Department of Transportation and the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, which includes our state wildlife agency. Wildlife crossings, as you may know, such as overpasses and underpasses, help create safe road crossings for wildlife, which can help ensure the continuity of migration patterns and facilitate more local travel patterns for resources. And connecting habitats has been gaining popularity among the public and legislatures. And numerous states have taken action to study and improve habitat connectivity through wildlife crossings. And this is good for animals. It can also improve public safety, save costs, and protect drivers and improve biodiversity and also climate resiliency. Although not quite law yet, the Animal Legal Defense Fund is proud of the incredible progress that has been made and potential victories on several bills. We're grateful to have worked with coalition partners and legislators to support the following bills, which have seen recent major progress. In California, several bills have been passed by the legislature and sent to the governor. And that includes plant-based meals. California Plant-Based Meals School Food and Beverage Program provides school districts an additional state funding and staff training and other support to help schools serve more plant-based meals. Also, wildlife connectivity requires the Department of Wildlife to study areas for potential wildlife connectivity and to coordinate with the transportation agency to develop an action plan in the next few years and continue to update that every 5 years thereafter. In New York, the legislature is in the second year of a 2-year session, and colleagues played a strong role in the coalitions to support 2 very significant animal protection bills. The puppy mill pipeline ban prohibits the sale of dogs, cats, and rabbits by retail pet shops and authorizes space for adoption. The legislation passed both houses of the legislature with overwhelming bipartisan support, and the governor has until the end of the year to take action on this legislation, and we continue to advocate in support of the bill. And if you're based in New York, we would welcome your assistance, as well as the cruelty-free cosmetics bill, which prohibits the manufacture or sale of cosmetics tested on animal. This also passed the legislature with overwhelming bipartisan support and is awaiting the governor's action. Also in Massachusetts, there are several bills that haven't yet landed on the governor's desk, but have passed at least one chamber. There's the Puppies and Kittens bill, which is an omnibus bill that protects animals and consumers. It passed in the Senate this summer. The bill prohibits the sale of puppies and kittens under 8 weeks of age. It requires promulgation of rules and regulations for kennels used for boarding or doggy daycares, as well as breeding kennels. It would end the roadside sale of animals and clarify that the law does not consider dogs and cats livestock. There's also a rodenticides bill, which would facilitate monitoring and reduce the use of what's known as second generation anticoagulant rodenticides, or SGARs, in Massachusetts to protect our wildlife, companion animals, and children. SGARs are a particularly toxic group of poisons used as a form of so-called rodent control, and when ingested, they prevent blood clotting and typically cause the individual who ingested the poison to suffer heavy internal bleeding and often eventually cause death. And that poison can remain in the individual's system for days. So then non-target animals, such as birds of prey, who rely on rodents as a food source, are often poisoned. In Massachusetts, facilities see also dozens of cases of poisoned companion animals each year. And this legislation would mandate increased use of what's called integrated pest management, or IPM plans, which seek to resolve human-animal conflicts with minimal risks to humans, wild animals, and the environment. And this would be specifically on public institutions of higher education. State law already requires school and childcare centers to adopt IPM strategies. And IPM uses multiple methods to prevent and address rodent conflicts, For example, it could include sealing building holes and cracks, adequately sealing trash and dumpsters, and removing potential nesting materials from an area of conflict. This legislation also requires the digitization of pesticide use forms to allow for better data collection and monitoring. Some issues related to companion animals that we work on across the states and you may see introduced in some places this January include the courtroom animal advocate program laws, post-conviction animal possession bans, and retail pet store sales. These courtroom animal advocate program, or CAP laws, allow legal practitioners, supervised law students, or volunteer lawyers to advocate for animal victims in criminal cruelty cases. Volunteers appear in court and assist the judge by drafting briefs, conducting research, gathering information from veterinarians, animal control officers, law enforcement officials, and making recommendations specifically on behalf of the animal victims' interests. CAP laws do not create any new criminal violations or penalties, nor do they change which animals are eligible for criminal protection. They work within a state's existing animal cruelty statutes. Possession ban laws limit convicted animal cruelty offenders' access to animals. For example, after a person is convicted of a certain animal cruelty crime, the court may prohibit or may be required to prohibit the defendant from owning or possessing or having contact with an animal for a period of time. In some states, such a prohibition is statutorily authorized, or in some cases, it's mandated. And these possession bans are one of the most effective ways to prevent repeat offenses. They restrict an abuser's access to animals, which drastically limits the pool of potential victims. And they can also allow law enforcement to intervene quickly to protect at-risk animals. A number of states already have mandatory possession bans for post-conviction. Some of those are limited to specific species or specific crimes, such as animal sexual assault. And then others are statutorily authorized, but not mandated. So in some cases, there's room to improve existing laws or to pass laws where these don't already exist. And finally, retail pet sales, which are sometimes called puppy mill bills, and they're a powerful way to fight back against puppy mills. They prohibit pet stores from selling dogs and cats and sometimes additional animals like rabbits that are sourced from commercial breeders. Instead, stores can offer animals available for adoption from rescues and shelters. Some issues related to wildlife that we work on across states include circus bills and fur sales bans. Circus bills prohibit the use of certain wild animals in circuses and traveling shows. These animals are routinely subjected to neglect, abusive training, and prolonged confinement. And fur sales ban prohibit the sale of new fur products, including clothing, fashion accessories, and home decor in a given state. Millions of animals are killed for their fur each year, and some are trapped in the wild, but the vast majority are raised in factory farm-like fur farms. Some of the issues related to farmed animals that we work on in various states include confinement bans. While farmed animals are often left out of state animal cruelty and protection laws, a growing number of states have adopted measures to limit the use of intensive confinement farming practices. These usually prohibit the practice of cramming animals in cages or crates so small they can barely move. Confinement bans may prohibit the use of specifically gestation crates for mother pigs, veal crates for calves raised for veal, and or battery cages for egg-laying hens. These laws may also prohibit the sale of products coming from animals raised in such confinement, regardless of the jurisdiction where that animal was raised. More than a dozen states have passed such laws, and most with phase-in dates over the next few years, but there are more states that could pass such laws. Rodeo-related bills. Rodeos are dangerous and cruel. Horse, bull, steer, and calves are often forced to participate in these events and may suffer broken ribs, backs, legs, torn tails, punctured lungs, and more serious injuries and sometimes agonizing deaths. A handful of states, California, Rhode Island, and Nevada, have passed laws that ban or tightly regulate rodeo events, and some cities are also beginning to pass ordinances as well. And legislation can address some of the cruelest rodeo practices. So, for example, engaging in calf roping, where a calf is captured by a lasso, or the use of electric prods. The Federal Animal Welfare Act exempts rodeos from its protections. So state laws protecting animals used in rodeos from these most severe types of abuse are really critically needed. Some issues related to animals in research. There's the adoption of retired research animals, which I mentioned earlier in the context of the Beagle Bill. So it requires dogs and cats at research institutions or product testing facilities to be offered for adoption through nonprofit animal shelter or rescue, or through private placement once research ends, if a necropsy is not mandated. Other states have passed these beyond Massachusetts, a growing number, and people who've adopted these animals attest that they can truly flourish once they're out of a laboratory setting. Alternatives bills require the manufacturer and contract testing facilities to use test methods that replace animal testing of products and ingredients when they are available and provide information of equivalent or better scientific quality and relevance for the intended purpose. And so it applies to products like cosmetics, household cleaners, industrial chemicals, like those in paint, for example. And then the cosmetic sales bans prohibit the sale of cosmetics that were developed or manufactured using animal tests. The Animal Legal Defense Fund encourages advocates to lobby for stronger animal protection laws in their local communities and can provide guidance to advocates that are interested in changing laws at the city and county level. Local legislation is truly a powerful tool to help animals, and these can help animals in your own community, as well as help raise the profile of an issue at a higher level of government. So at the state level, for example. So dozens of cities and counties enacted retail pet sales bans in California before the state enacted the first statewide retail pet sale ban. Additionally, a number of California cities passed fur-free laws before the state enacted the first statewide fur product sales ban. So change at the local level really matters for your own community and at this higher level of government. So, as I mentioned earlier, there are so many ways that you can get involved and help, and these are just a few of them. You can find your elected officials via the link on here, aldf.org/findmyrep. And one of the things that we would really recommend is adding their contact information to your own phone and email so you can reach out to them very easily. And review each legislator's bio and look for connections. Maybe you went to the same high school, or maybe you participate in the same volunteer activities. You can also follow them on social or subscribe to their e-newsletters. And we really encourage you to call and email about pending legislation. We reach out to advocates as often as we can via email and social to share opportunities to engage. And you can find those specifically for your state on our website. But the most important thing is to make a personal connection and start to develop a relationship with this person. So this is another way to think about engaging in animal advocacy, is to think of who you know that can also help influence elected officials. And these are just some examples of what those could be. Do you have friends or family in key legislative districts? Do you know influential community members? Are there other organizations that may support the issues we work on? And do you have connections to elected officials, whether they represent you or another district nearby, or their staff? Because that is something that in states where elected officials do have staff, those relationships can make a huge difference in furthering legislation. Also, do you happen to have celebrity contacts? Maybe that can help us shine an extra light on the legislation that we're working on, or corporate connections, for example. So these are a few other links that might be helpful. You can explore more of the work that our program does at aldf.org/legislation. You can find your state's ranking. We rank animal protection laws, specifically criminal animal cruelty issues, at aldf.org/state rankings. You can sign up for our email action alerts and at aldf.org/signup. And then some of the other webinars that might be helpful to watch are our Lobby 101 and how to advocate for animals. And then finally, you may be interested in reviewing our model animal protection laws. Those are some of the issues that I highlighted already, and would be happy, anyone on our team would be happy to talk through those and how they could apply in your jurisdiction if similar laws aren't already on the books. So thank you so much for joining us today. We truly couldn't do this work without the support of advocates and citizen lobbyists like you. For the latest information, please do sign up for our emails and follow us on social. And you can email our staff in legislative affairs with any state-specific inquiries.
Great. Thank you so much, Steph. So we will go ahead and get into our questions. So our first question is, does ALDF work to oppose legislation on ag-gag laws, and or do we work on legislation to protect whistleblowers and activists?
We absolutely do. And we actually have fantastic information on our website about both of these issues. So if you just search in Google aldf.org ag-gag, you'll see all of the work that's been done by the legislative affairs team in conjunction with large coalitions, as well as the work of our litigation program to help fight those laws. Ag-gag laws are laws that typically they remove access to information about what's happening in factory farms. So they might criminalize, for example, taking photos or video recordings on farms, or even penalize workers who are trying to report issues. And so in that way, it relates to whistleblowers. And absolutely, we do work to try to protect whistleblowers as well. And in fact, we recently, in a number of states, put up some billboards seeking whistleblowers, because we know that there are a lot of problems happening, behind closed doors on these factory farms and in other facilities in the industrial agriculture space. And so we were seeking whistleblowers, whether they had concerns about animals and their welfare, or about workers' rights and beyond, environmental concerns, et cetera. And so you can find some more info about both of those things on our website.
Great, thank you. Another question regarding cosmetics bill. Does the prohibition of cosmetics tested on animals include items and brands that are sold in countries that require animal testing by law?
That is a good question. Uh, I believe that it would not apply when they are required. That is my recollection. And the language is probably a little bit different from state to state. And if you have a question about what that looks like in a specific state, I'm happy to help take a look. So feel free to email me and we can connect on that.
Thank you. Our next question is regarding CAP. Do you know, is there any way to learn when CAP opportunities are available? Would that be on our website?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there are only a few states that have these courtroom animal advocate programs so far, but it's an issue that our organization is working hard to expand to more and more states. We do have information about those laws, and it'll be super accessible if you just type in ALDF into Google and courtroom animal advocate program. You'll see more information about what that can look like and what volunteering can look like. And we work both to pass legislation to create these programs, these CAP programs in states, as well as to facilitate their getting them off the ground and making sure that things are running smoothly. And that's done. There's a really good collaboration between the Legislative Affairs program and our criminal justice program to make that happen.
Great, thank you. My next question is, as we saw, there's only a few states that are in session right now, but if your state is in session, like mine, Michigan, where should you go to see what is on their docket?
Yeah. So if you're interested in finding out what animal protection bills may be pending in your state at this time that are priorities for the Animal Legal Defense Fund, it's actually very easy to find that info. So if you just type in aldf.org/your state name, so aldf.org/Michigan, for example, and that will pull up any open action alerts, which are opportunities that we specifically craft for advocates to engage at key points in the legislative process to reach out to. Usually it's their own elected official, but in some cases it might be a key decision maker. So maybe a committee chair where a certain piece of legislation is pending, or another member of, say, legislative leadership. So those opportunities are listed on that state page. And then you'll also see information about your state's ranking in that animal protection state rankings guide that I mentioned. You'll see info about that ranking. Where is your state doing really well in terms of animal protection laws? Where is there room for improvement? And also you'll see whether or not there are opportunities in your state specifically. You'll see some opportunities at the federal level because everyone can engage on those. And then also, if you want to dig more into things that are pending in your state, you can also check out your state legislature's website. And usually just a quick search, internet search for your state name and then state legislature will take you to that state legislative website. Each one is a little bit different. Some are trickier to navigate than others, but most of them will provide an opportunity to do some sort of keyword search. So if you're interested in a specific type of issue, you can usually find it that way. Also, feel free to reach out to the Leg Affairs team, and we're happy to help figure that out with you.
Great, thank you. And our last question for today is, I'd like to contact my representative, but I'm a little nervous to do so. Do you have any advice for people who are contacting representatives for the first time? Or maybe the 10th time and are still nervous?
It's such a good question. If it's the first time, what I really recommend doing is finding some sort of bio for them online and just getting a sense of what their background is and maybe where there's some areas of overlap. I think I mentioned earlier, did you go to the same high school? Do you live near each other? Do you, maybe they have in-district office hours at a coffee shop that you frequent already. And so just something that's really, maybe they have a companion animal that they include in their bio, or if not in their bio, you might want to check them out on their social media pages. And you might see they have a companion animal at home, and that can always be a really easy icebreaker. And it's so important to just remember that these are people too, and they truly want to hear from you. You are their constituent, and so they want to hear from you, or they should want to hear from you. And going in with that mindset can really help make things easy. You can also set a time frame. You can reach out to them and ask for just time for 15 minutes to talk about animal issues, and you could do that whether or not there's animal protection legislation pending. They may be willing to sit down and just have a conversation generally. And it's important to know that if in states where there are legislative staff, if you get scheduled to have an appointment or a phone call with the staff, that's nothing to be concerned about at all, and it can be a really good thing. Staff sometimes know a lot more about a given issue than the elected. Maybe they have staff that are covering certain issue areas, and so they can become the expert within their legislative office and relay that information to the elected official. So sometimes those are the best connections to have. So whether you reach out to the office and you get a legislator or staff, it's still a fantastic opportunity to have a conversation. Those are some of my tips, but it can be intimidating. And I just encourage you to just try to push through anyway. Maybe bring a friend, somebody else from the district if possible, and do it together, even if it's a phone call or an in-person meeting in district or in the building. And you could reach out to the elected official's office and find out which they're up for, or propose whichever makes you more comfortable, even if they don't have an in-district office. If you know the town that they live in, and you're close enough to that, you can just ask to meet at a coffee shop or somewhere that makes you feel comfy.
Great advice. Thank you so much, Steph, for spending time with us today. And thank you, everyone, for joining us and having such a great conversation.
Thanks so much, everyone.